Good afternoon, good day, and welcome to Free Press Live. My name is Colette Watson, and we're here with a few updates from the world of media and technology advocacy, plus some special guests. Today we have Matt Wood and Dana Floberg from Free Press to talk to us about the Emergency Broadband Benefit and what it means for the digital divide. But before we get into that, I do want to let you know about a few interesting things happening around the world of media and technology. So according to San Diego Tribune this week, San Diego Board of Supervisors considered a proposal by Supervisor Tara Lawson-Remer to end the practice of charging incarcerated people for phone calls and video visits. If the proposal is approved, San Diego would become the third city to make jail calls free following San Francisco and New York. And here at Free Press, we've been heavily involved in advocacy for the Martha Wright Reed Act, introduced by Senator Tammy Duckworth, which encourages making these calls affordable across the country. So we'll be keeping an eye on what happens there in San Diego. On to other news. Advocates from ADL, Color of Change, Free Press, Muslim advocates, and Stop Online Violence Against Women have joined forces as the real Facebook Oversight Board, not to be confused with the Facebook Oversight Board created by that organization, to deal with its content moderation issues. Advocates at the real Facebook Oversight Board published a letter to the editor of The New Yorker this week, which was submitted in response to their story titled Inside the Making of Facebook's Supreme Court, published February 12th. In this letter, the real Facebook Oversight Board said, quote, "We want to underscore the extent to which Facebook's disastrous management of its own platforms and now the Oversight Board's role in that process is fundamentally a civil rights, human rights, and anti-bias issue." You can read the full letter at rfob.medium.com. In exciting news on this Wednesday, which would be today if you're watching live, the New Jersey Civic Info Consortium has announced that it is now accepting applications for its inaugural round of grant funding, which is a milestone in a years-long effort led by residents, journalists, and local organizations to invest public funding to foster more informed communities. The News Voices Project at Free Press, led by Mike Rispoli and many others, worked for years on the ground in New Jersey to help make this a reality. We're excited to see what applications come through and what grant funding is extended to community media makers there in the state of New Jersey. On last Thursday, the FCC finalized rules for its Emergency Broadband Benefit program. The $3.2 billion program will provide a monthly discount to millions of people struggling to afford internet access. Congress mandated the benefit as part of the December stimulus bill. The program offers a monthly benefit of up to $50 or up to $75 on tribal lands to low-income families, students, and others who've lost jobs or income due to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can learn more about this at freepress.net/news, but you can also learn about it from our guests today. So I want to welcome right now my colleagues, Dana Floberg and Matt Wood, from our policy team here at Free Press, who've worked harder than I could express in words to make the Emergency Broadband Benefit a reality alongside our amazing activists and allies in this field. Matt, Dana, hello, and welcome to Free Press Live. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, doing all right. Good to be here.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Wonderful to have you. So I want to start off with a question for you, Matt, if that's okay. Tell us about how the Emergency Broadband Benefit came to pass at the FCC and in Congress, and what was Free Press's role in this? Tell us about your work.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's funny. It's hard to believe the pandemic has been going on for a year now in the U.S. and even longer than that in other places. And that's been the story here, too. This is something that really got started almost a whole year ago now. We talk about the digital divide a lot in this country and in DC and in our organization. And oftentimes when people talk about that, they only focus on deployment, like what areas of our country and rural areas in particular don't have broadband access. And that's important, but it's obviously not the only part of this divide. In fact, it's not the biggest part either. The biggest part is people who do have access in cities and country areas too, rural areas too, and just can't afford to get online. And so at the start of the pandemic last March, we all knew that. We've helped, I think, at Free Press to change the conversation and make sure this divide conversation focuses on those people too. And in a pandemic mode and an emergency response mode, building new networks is also not the fastest or the easiest thing to do. The focus really was, starting last March, on how do we get more money into people's hands to make sure they can get connected to broadband. When internet is, essential no matter what, but especially has been essential during this time when people are staying at home and relying on internet connections to do so much of their daily lives, school, work, healthcare, everything. Social connections, civic responsibilities, and voting and everything that we saw last year. So that's when it started last March. And like everything in lobbying and in politics, unfortunately, it can feel kind of like it's taking forever and it's really rushed at the same time. So we started working on this bill with champions in Congress and staffers who work for them on Capitol Hill last March. House Democrats, Senate Democrats had it in the works. Last March, there was a big COVID response package that passed and didn't contain any funding like this. Then the Democrats on the House side managed to pass this bill and lots of other good broadband pieces too that we could talk about last May. And there it sat. The Republican-led Senate at the time didn't take it up. The House Democrats, for good measure, passed it again a couple more times. It's a little bit funny to think of, but they basically brought the same ideas back in another bill in July and another one later in the year, and had passed this 2 and 3 times over before it finally made it into the big must pass, is a cliche that we use sometimes. Like we finally got to do something, and finally the Senate woke up and helped to pass this spending and stimulus bill at the end of the year, and that's how this piece of legislation came to be in Congress. And now it's been handed off to the FCC. So as you said, Colette, the FCC is now moving and trying to make some rules around it and get the program up and running. And that's really where Dana and others on our staff have been as involved as I have, if not more, in handing that off from the lawmakers in Congress and saying, here you go, federal agency, please make this work and let's get some people connected and get some money into their hands so they can do it more affordably.
Wow, that's incredible, Matt, to really hear the journey that a policy like this goes through, from being considered to not being taken up to being taken up, and then now to passing. I think that's incredible, especially when I think about all of the legislation that often ends up dying on Mitch McConnell's desk, for instance, or in other ways in our government. What does the passage of this policy mean to activists?
I mean, I think it means that we see federal government and lawmakers being responsive to what they are hearing from their constituents. Nobody walks around, in my experience, and says, my internet bill is too low. People sort of feel it in their bones and feel it every month. And if we're lucky enough to be connected, it's expensive. Many people aren't lucky enough. As I said, it's this digital divide. Our research now suggests that something like almost 80 million people are offline and not able to access this life-saving and necessary technology at this point. So that is something that people are fully aware of. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of pressure and a lot of time to get lawmakers to not just hear that complaint, but actually do something about it. So even though this is only a $3 billion program, $3.2 billion, and it's temporary in nature and based on response to the pandemic, and could run out of money before we're anywhere close to being done with this job and with this duty to make sure everybody is connected. It's a start, and it's Congress actually putting some money where their mouth is for a change and providing some funding to get people connected rather than just talking about the problem and having it lie there unfinished the way it so often happened, not just in the last Congress, but really in every Congress.
Absolutely. It is a start. It is a great start, I think, for many people who've labored on this for quite a long time, and the people directly impacted. As you mentioned, nearly 80 million, which I know you had the opportunity to testify about that recently in front of Congress, Matt. Dana, I want to ask you, when we talk about nearly 80 million people in this country not having adequate internet access, we hear the term digital divide all the time. But why are there so many people disconnected from internet access in this country? And what would you say can be done about it?
Yeah, that's a really good and I think really important question, because the digital divide is broad. When we use that term, we're usually referring to layers of inequities that keep certain communities offline, that keep people from connecting. And there's a lot of different reasons that people can be disconnected. Maybe there's no broadband in their area. Maybe they maybe they don't have the speeds that they want offered. But the most important, the primary reason that most of these 77 million, almost 80 million people don't have adequate internet, we see in study after study comes down to high prices, lack of affordability, people who would like to connect to the internet, but can't find a way to afford the prices that are being charged for that service. And this is not too unexpected when we consider that the broadband market across the board is largely there's very little competition and there's very little regulation, especially after we've seen this past administration's Federal Communications Commission sort of throwing out their legal basis for authority to do anything to bridge the digital divide, to really even investigate, are there problems going on in the broadband market? Are people being billed unfairly? What are people being charged? We don't currently, as a nation, collect any real comprehensive data about what people are actually being charged for broadband. So we know from the data, people are being charged too much because they're not able to afford it. There's so many people that can't get online because they can't find the money to pay for those bills. But if you were to ask, okay, what's the average amount that's being charged? What are people being charged in this community or this community? We don't have clear answers because we've decided not to collect that data. And I think so often that's really where, when we start talking about what can we do about this divide, first we need to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge that this isn't just about building broadband into areas. This is also about making sure that broadband is affordable and that everyone can access it. We need to know what people are being charged. We need to know who's online and who is not online. A big piece of the digital divide that Free Press has published research about in the past is that not only is affordability keeping low-income Americans offline, but consistently we also see that people of color lag behind white people in terms of broadband adoption. And a lot of this is due to systemic and historical problems and racism that have made it so that people of color are more likely to have lower incomes than white people. But our research has also found that even when we control for that, even when we say, okay, all things being equal, if we control for income, if we control for education, geography, everything we can think of, there is still a gap, which also implies that in addition to all of these other problems, in addition to broadband being just too expensive for everyone, there's some element of racial discrimination that's operating independently in this market. And we need to figure out what that is. And then we need to have the tools to really address that. A lot of times for us, this comes down to empowering the Federal Communications Commission to look into these problems, to figure out what's going on, and to start trying to intervene and make sure that broadband can be more affordable and more equitably available for everyone.
Wow. Thank you, Dana. When you lay that out, it just makes it apparent that there's so much information that we don't have that I think a lot of people watching probably would take for granted is known by our government and our regulators. When you say that it's often about empowering the FCC, would you say that that our current FCC is making any strides? Because we have recently had an election. Don't know if you heard, it didn't get many headlines. But for instance, I know the FCC is undertaking updating our nation's broadband maps. And also I know that we are looking again at Title II, which for folks watching may not mean a lot, but what does Title II have to do with all of this? And is this new FCC holding any promise on these issues that you've laid out?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful on this front. Title II, I think, for anybody for whom that does sound familiar, we tend to talk about it as the legal authority that gives the FCC the ability to protect net neutrality. And it is. That's one of the big fights that we've been having in DC for years and years now, trying to protect net neutrality and needing Title II and an FCC that has Title II authority in order to really, truly be able to protect an open internet and make sure that ISPs, internet service providers, aren't discriminating against people online. But Title II as a law actually does a lot more than that. It gives the FCC the authority over broadband to say, this is a service that we need to be able to investigate, to regulate. We need to be able to make sure that providers are not discriminating against folks. We need to make sure that this gives us the power to ensure, or at least start asking questions about how we protect privacy, how we make sure that disabled folks can also get online equitably, whether there are unfair billing practices that are going on, making sure that everything is being offered on reasonable and just terms. So there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about Title II hopefully coming back. The acting chairwoman of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, has been a strong supporter of Title II, and this administration has certainly made some strong strides towards being supportive. Certainly the efforts we've seen the FCC taking already, trying to get the emergency broadband benefit in place, are all really great reasons to be optimistic. We need Title II back to be able to really follow through on a lot of that promise.
Wow, thank you for that. You know, Matt, I want to give you a chance to get in here. What feels possible to you right now in this climate?
Yeah, I mean, Dana covered a lot of it. I think it really is about getting the agency back in the place where it has that authority. And it's funny, agencies have some ability to determine what their own authority is. So it's sort of a bizarre facet of policymaking and lawmaking in this space too. But the last FCC decided to throw that authority away. Said, we don't want it. If we regulate cable and phone companies, that will do all sorts of bad things. It'll cost us jobs and cost us investment. None of that happened to be true. And at Free Press, we've also done a lot of research, not just on these crucial digital divide issues, but on that kind of marketplace response. Like, what do the cable and phone companies actually do in response to these regulations? The truth is, basically, they didn't change their stripes at all. They kept investing. They're never really doing a good enough job, if you ask us, but nothing really took them off that trajectory that they were on when we had these kinds of stronger rules and stronger authority in place at the FCC back in the last administration, or I guess I have to say 2 times ago now. So this last FCC threw it away. As Dana said, the new FCC hasn't done it yet. They're kind of deadlocked right now. Another parting gift from the last administration and the last Congress is the FCC right now does not have its full complement of 5 commissioners. They're stuck at 2-2. And so we're in a little bit of a, we expect great things to happen, but we're not there yet mode where we have to hold them accountable and keep putting good pressure on them and good thoughts and input into the FCC processes underway. But like I said before, it's just a weird fact of life here in DC. It's both an incredibly fast timeline and a glacial pace at the same time. It's glacial for people who need this assistance right now. And yet, this FCC under the new acting chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, has turned it around in a timely fashion. They had 60 days to try to come up with some rules to get the Emergency Broadband Benefit program in place, and they did it. And, that's not to discount the fact that people needed this money a year ago or, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's not even just about the pandemic. And yet, they are doing everything they can, even facing some difficulties that come along with any kind of administration changeover and transition like this. And especially one that's been so, I don't know what the right euphemism here would be, unusual, downright traumatic. I mean, with all the things that happened here in DC before the transition and the insurrection that happened at the Capitol, it's been anything but business as usual. And yet, the new administration isn't there yet, but they, as Dana said so well, seem to be moving in the right direction and to have the right ideas in mind as to where they need to get.
Wow. Well, that's encouraging to hear. Thank you both. And for folks who want to understand more about what is happening with the Federal Communications Commission, we definitely invite you to visit freepress.net/news, where we are giving regular updates on what is happening with the acting commissioner, as well as the various measures that are being considered, including the passage last week of the Emergency Broadband Benefit. So I think that, for anyone watching who isn't familiar with Title II, it sounds like it's definitely worth learning more about and advocating for, so that we can have some sort of oversight to protect our rights to adequate internet. But for many people, as Matt just mentioned, it's even more urgent than that. It's a time of COVID-19, and really critical need for these connections. Dana, I know that you are working with a coalition that's going by hashtag no shutoffs. And preview for our viewers, we are actually going to talk a little bit more about that on our episode in 2 weeks of Free Press Live. But could you preview that just a little bit for us, Dana, and tell us about no shutoffs and what you're asking Congress to do, and how that connects to this conversation of the digital divide?
Yeah, absolutely. The No Shutoffs Coalition is actually a partnership between groups that work on issues, broadband issues, telecommunications issues, as well as groups that work on electricity justice and water justice. And what this group has come together to call for is for a federal moratorium prohibiting water companies, power companies, and broadband companies from shutting off service to folks during the pandemic if they can't afford to pay their bills. This being another way that we really need to start prioritizing people and their human rights needs to access these essential services over the profit interest of these various companies that have been generally, at least certainly on the broadband front, have been doing fairly well during the pandemic as a counterpoint to the rest of us with so many people losing jobs and income. So that's really what that group has been pushing for, is how do we make it so that nobody loses access to their electricity, their water, or their broadband during this pandemic when those essential services are even more necessary.
Wow. That's amazing work, Dana. I'm excited to talk about it more with you on March 17th. And excited to see Congress enact that moratorium. I'm going to speak in the affirmative that it will happen, because I know so many of our folks are depending on it. Matt, what else is on the horizon for our broadband work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it. And there should be more coming from Congress, too. We talked a lot about the FCC now because they are the ones who make the rules and kind of get the system moving once Congress puts stuff in place. But there's a lot more Congress could do. There's everything that you and Dana just talked about on the no shutoffs front. And that is part of what we lost in what I described earlier, that rush job to get something done in December. The earlier bills passed by the House actually contained exactly that kind of moratorium and said, you can't shut people off in a pandemic. And that didn't pass through the Senate. And again, looking back at that last FCC and the Trump FCC, as we have to call it, Chairman Pai, who was there, they didn't do anything along those lines. They basically said, well, we'll ask companies not to shut people off, but we're not going to make them keep people connected. That's the kind of thing that Title II could do. And they could say, no, we're not just asking, we're telling you, please, you don't shut people off during a time like this, or frankly, any time when these services are so essential. So we have those pieces in existing legislation that not only was written, but passed. And if we can get Congress to put them back together into a new package, we have a lot of hope. The December bill was incredibly important, but it's not the end of the line. People have heard a lot about the current stimulus package moving through first the House and now the Senate here in March of 2021. And that has some additional broadband funding. We need to get even more money into the system and not just only put money in, but also think about smart ways to spend it. And as Dana said, smart ways to regulate the companies too. So we're not simply feeding the beast and saying, okay, Comcast says they need more money from the taxpayers to keep people connected. That's true. We do need to have more subsidies and more thought about the funding and just what it costs. But we also need to find ways to make the broadband marketplace more competitive and just get people more options. A lot of cities have done it themselves and started to build their own networks. And, cable companies have lobbied to make that kind of thing illegal, which sounds ridiculous, but it's true. They've gotten states to pass bills prohibiting cities and towns from having their own internet access. So, all of that comes together. It's really an all of the above approach for us of trying to go to Congress to get more money, but also get smarter rules in place. And then once that happens, getting the Federal Communications Commission and other people in charge of implementing those programs to do the job and actually get the money out the door and hold cable and phone companies accountable when they don't do it the right way.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Matt. And I think, when you talk about some of the very ridiculous things that cable companies have lobbied for a lot of people, as you begin to peel back those layers, it's actually not it starts off laughable and then it gets very unfunny pretty quickly when we realize the impact on folks' lives and ability to access healthcare, jobs, family connections, and other lifelines. I think also there's an important point to make here, which is that for many, many years, and I'm actually going to quote our colleague from Free Press, Joseph Torres, that political leaders, especially right-wing politicians, have long used racist narratives to launch disinformation campaigns in effort to pass policies that benefit corporations but hurt working people and harm our social safety net. I think when you kind of wonder to yourself, how is it that a Comcast or other sort of media mega corporation could make it so that we can't do the things we need to do to ensure that our communities have broadband, among many other things? How does that happen? I think it happens in the way, the narratives that are put forward in many cases by these lobbying machines with help from, in many cases, right-wing politicians. If you'd like to read that piece that I just quoted, we're going to drop it into the comments here. And it's called Media, Racism, COVID-19, and Our Fragile Social Safety Net. But I could talk to you two about this all day. Matt Wood and Dana Floberg, certainly considered foremost experts at the intersection of internet rights and public interest. But we only have until 3 p.m. Eastern. We're here every Wednesday on Facebook Live. The name of the show is Free Press Live. And our organization is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. that's been fighting for communications rights for about 16 years. Is that right, y'all? And hoping to keep at it for a lot longer, but we will need your support in order to do that. So I invite, if you're watching and enjoying, I invite you to share it and also to visit freepress.net to donate to support our work. Again, my name is Colette Watson, and we've been here today with Matt Wood and Dana Floberg. Any final words before we go?
Thank you so much for having us on and having this pretty important conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much work left to do, and yet, we're helping to push the boulder up the hill thanks to people watching and listening and taking part, and that's why we couldn't do it without that, and have a lot left to do anyway, even though we've made some strides here in the last few months.
Absolutely. We've made great strides and due in no small part to your efforts and, of course, those of our amazing activists and allies, some of whom may be watching. So thank you to everyone watching, and we will see you next Wednesday and every Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time here on Free Press Live. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.